BBC Radio 1 is a British radio station operated by the British Broadcasting Corporation, which also broadcasts internationally, specialising in modern and current popular music and chart hits throughout the day. Radio 1 provides alternative genres after 7 p.m, including electronic dance, hip-hop, rock, indie or interviews. It is aimed primarily at the 15-29 age group, although the average age of the UK audience in 2008 was 33. History. First broadcast. Radio 1 was established in 1967 as a successor to the BBC Light programme, which had broadcast popular music and other entertainment since 1945. Radio 1 was conceived as a direct response to the popularity of offshore pirate radio stations such as Radio Caroline and Radio London, which had been outlawed by Act of Parliament. Radio 1 was launched at 7 a.m. on Saturday, 30 September 1967. The first disc jockey to broadcast on the new station was Tony Blackburn, whose cheery style, first heard on Radio Caroline and Radio London, won him the prime slot on what became known as the Radio 1 breakfast show. The first words on Radio 1 a year after a countdown by the controller of Radios 1 and 2, Robin Scott, and a jingle, recorded at PAMS in Dallas, Texas, beginning the voice of Radio 1 a year were. And, good morning everyone. Welcome to the exciting new sound of Radio 1 inch. This was the first use of US-style jingles on BBC Radio, but the style was familiar to listeners who were acquainted with Blackburn and other DJs from their days on pirate radio. The first complete record played on Radio 1 was Flowers in the Rain by The Move. The second single was Massachusetts by the Bee Gees. The breakfast show remains the most prized slot in the Radio 1 schedule, with every change of breakfast show presenter exciting considerable media interest. The initial rota of staff included John Peel and a gaggle of others, some hired from pirates, such as Keith Skews, Ed Stewart, Mike Raven, David Ryder, Jim Fisher, Jimmy Young, Dave Cash, Kenny Everett, Simon D., Terry Wogan, Duncan Johnson, Doug Crawford, Tommy Vance, Chris Deming, Emperor Roscoe, Pete Murray, and Bob Honus. Many of the most popular pirate radio voices, such as Simon D., had only a one-hour slot per week. Annie Nightingale, who joined in 1970, was Britain's first female DJ and is now the longest-serving presenter, having constantly evolved her musical tastes with the times. 1970s peak. Initially, the station was unpopular with some of its target audience who, it is claimed, disliked the fact that much of its airtime was shared with Radio 2 and that it was less unequivocally aimed at a young audience than the offshore stations, with some DJs such as Jimmy Young being in their 40s. The very fact that it was part of an establishment institution such as the BBC was a turn-off for some, and needle time restrictions prevented it from playing as many records as offshore stations had. It also had limited finances and often, as in January 1975, suffered disproportionately when the BBC had to make financial cutbacks, strengthening an impression that it was regarded as a lower priority by senior BBC executives. Despite this, it gained massive audiences, becoming the most listened-to station in the world with audiences of over 10 million claimed for some of his shows. In the early mid-1970s, Radio 1 presenters were rarely out of the British tabloids, thanks to the publicity department's high-profile work. The popularity of Radio 1's touring summer live broadcasts, the Radio 1 Roadshow, usually as part of the BBC Radio Week's promotions that took Radio 1, 2 and 4 shows on the road, drew some of the largest crowds of the decade. The station undoubtedly played a role in maintaining the high sales of 45 RPM single records, although it benefited from a lack of competition. Apart from Radio Luxembourg and Manx Radio in the Isle of Man, Alan Freeman's Saturday Rock Show was voted Best Radio Show 5 years running by readers of a national music publication, and was then axed by controller Derek Chinnery. 1990s changes. In his last few months as controller, Johnny Beerling commissioned a handful of new shows that in some ways set the tone for what was to come under Matthew Bannister. One of these, Loud and Proud, was the UK's first national radio series aimed at a gay audience. Far from being a parting quirk, The show was a surprise hit and led to the network's first coverage of the large outdoor gay pride event in 1994. Bannister took the reins fully in October 1993. His aim was to rid the station of its smashy and nicey image and make it appeal to the under-25s. Although originally launched as a youth station, by the early 1990s, its loyal listeners had aged with the station over its 25-year history. Many long-standing DJs, such as Simon Bates, Dave Lee Travis, Alan Freeman, Bob Harris, Gary Davis, and later Steve Wright, Bruno Brooks and Johnny Walker left the station or were sacked, and in January 1995 old music was banned from the daytime playlist. Many listeners rebelled as the first new DJs to be introduced represented a crossover from other parts of the BBC with Emma Freud and Danny Baker. Another problem was that, at the time, Radio 2 was sticking resolutely to a format which appealed mainly to those who had been listening since the days of the Light programme, and commercial radio, which was targeting the Radio 1.5 audience, consequently enjoyed a massive increase in its audience share at the expense of Radio 1. After the departure of Steve Wright, who had been unsuccessfully moved from his long-running afternoon show to The Breakfast Show in January 1994, Bannister hired Chris Evans to present the prime morning slot in April 1995. Evans was a popular but controversial presenter who was eventually sacked in 1997 after he demanded to present The Breakfast Show for only 4 days per week. Evans was replaced from February 17, 1997 by Mark Radcliffe, who found the slick, mass audience style required for a breakfast show did not come naturally to them. They were replaced by Zoe Ball and Kevin Greening 8 months later in October 1997, with Greening moving on and leaving Ball as solo presenter. The reinvention of the station happened at a fortuitous time, with the rise of Britpop in the mid-90s. Euro bands like Oasis, Blur and Pulp were popular and credible at the time and the station's popularity rose with them. Documentaries like John Peel's Lost in Music, which looked at the influence that the use of drugs have had over popular musicians, received critical acclaim but was slated inside Broadcasting House. Later in the 1990s the Britpop boom declined, and manufactured chart pop came to dominate the charts. New genre music occupied the evenings, with a mix of specialist shows and playlist fillers through late nights. The rise of rave culture through the late 1980s and early 1990s gave the station the opportunity to move into a controversial and youth-orientated movement by bringing in club DJ Pete Tong amongst others. There had been a dance music program on Radio 1 since 1987 and Pete Tong was the second DJ to present an all-dance music show. This quickly gave birth to the Essential Mix, where underground DJs mix electronic and club-based music in a 2-hour slot. Dance music has been a permanent feature on Radio 1 since, with club DJs such as Judge Jules, Danny Rampling and Seb Fontaine all having shows, as well as Radio 1 hosting an annual weekend in Ibiza. 2000s. Listening numbers continued to decline, but the station succeeded in targeting a younger age group and more cross-gender groups. Eventually, this change in content was reflected by a rise in audience that is continuing to this day. Notably, the station has received praise for shows such as The Surgery with Ald, Bobby Friction and Nell, The Evening Session with Steve Lamacq and its successor Zane Lowe. Its website has also been well received. However, The Breakfast Show and the UK Top 40 continued to struggle. In 2000, Zoe Ball was replaced in the mornings by friend and fellow Ladette Sarah Cox, but, despite heavy promotion, listening figures for The Breakfast Show continued to fall. In 2004 Cox was replaced by Chris Moyles. The newly rebranded Breakfast Show was known as The Chris Moyles Show and it increased its audience, ahead of the Today programme on Radio 4 as the second most popular breakfast show. Moyles continued to use innovative ways to try to tempt listeners from the Wake Up with Wogan show. In 2006, for example, creating a Say No to WOGAN campaign live on air. This angered the BBC hierarchy, though the row simmered down when it was clear that the campaign had totally failed to alter the listening trends of the time. Wogan still increased figures at a faster rate than Moyles. The chart show's ratings fell after the departure of longtime host Mark Goodyear, amid falling single sales in the UK. Ratings for the show fell in 2002 whilst Goodyear was still presenting the show, meaning that commercial radio's network chart overtook it in the ratings for the first time. However, the BBC denied he was being sacked. The BBC show now competes with networked commercial radio's The Big Top 40 show, which is broadcast at the same time. Many DJs either ousted by Bannister or who left during his tenure have joined Radio 2, which has now overtaken Radio 1 as the UK's most popular radio station, using a style that Radio 1 had until the early 1990s. The success of Moyles' show has come alongside increased success for the station in general. In 2006, DJs Chris Moyles, Scott Mills and Zane Lowe all won Gold Sony Radio Awards, while the station itself came away with the Best Station Award. A new evening schedule was introduced in September 2006, dividing the week by genre. Monday was mainly pop-funk rock oriented, Tuesday was R&B and hip-hop, Thursdays and Fridays were primarily dance, with specialist R&B and reggae shows. Following the death of John Peel in October 2004, Annie Nightingale is now the longest-serving presenter, having worked there since 1970. 2010s The license fee funding of Radio 1, alongside Radio 2, is often criticised by the commercial sector. In the first quarter of 2011, Radio 1 was part of an efficiency review conducted by John Myers. His role, according to Andrew Harrison, the chief executive of Radio Centre, was to identify both areas of best practice and possible savings. The controller of Radio 1 and sister station 1Xtra changed to Ben Cooper on October 28, 2011, following the departure of Andy Parfitt. Ben Cooper answers to the director of BBC Audio and Music, Tim Davie. On December 7, 2011, Ben Cooper's first major changes to the station were announced. Scream and Benga, Toddler T, Charlie Sloth and Friction replaced Judge Jules, Gillis Peterson, Kissy Sellout and Fabio and Groover Rider. A number of shows were shuffled to incorporate the new lineup. On February 28, 2012, further changes were announced. Greg James and Scott Mills swapped shows and Jamila Jamal, Gemma Kearney and Danny Howard joined the station. The new lineup of DJs for A New DJs We Trust was also announced, with B-Traits, Mosca, Jordan Suckley and Julio Bashmore hosting shows on a 4-weekly rotation. This new schedule took effect on Monday, 2 April 2012. In September 2012, Nick Grimshaw replaced Chris Moyles as host of Radio 1's Breakfast Show. Grimshaw previously hosted Monthur's 10 p.m. Midnight, Weekend Breakfast and Sunday evenings alongside Annie Mac. Grimshaw was replaced by Phil Taggart and Alice Levine on the 10 p.m. Midnight Show. In November 2012, another series of changes were announced. This included the departure of Reggie Yates and Vernon Kay. Jamila Jamal was announced as the new presenter of the official chart. Matt Edmondson will host a weekend morning show and Tom Deacon will return to present a Wednesday night show. Dan Howell and Phil Lester, famous YouTubers, also joined the station. The changes took effect in January 2013. Former Breakfast presenter Sarah Cox hosted her last show on Radio 1 in February 2014 before moving to Radio 2. In March 2014, Gemma Kearney left the Weekend Breakfast show to host the weekday early breakfast slot, swapping shows with Dev. In September 2014, Radio 1 operated a series of changes to their output which saw many notable presenters leave the station, including Edith Bowman, Nahal and Rob Darbank. Hugh Stevens gained a new show hosting 10 p.m. 1 a.m. onward, with Alice Levine presenting weekends 1 p.m. 4 p.m. Radio 1's residency also expanded, with Scream joining the rotational lineup on Thursday nights 10 p.m. 1 a.m. Broadcast Studios From inception for over 20 years, Radio 1 broadcast from an adjacent pair of continuity suites in the main control room of Broadcasting House. These comms were configured to allow DJs to operate the equipment themselves and play their own records and jingle cartridges. This was a departure from traditional BBC practice, where a studio manager would play in discs from the studio control cubicle. Due to needle time restrictions, much of the music was played from tapes of BBC session recordings. The DJs were assisted by one or more technical operators who would set up tapes and control sound levels during broadcasts. In 1985, Radio 1 moved across the road from Broadcasting House to Egton House. The station moved to Yarding House in 1996, and Egton House was demolished in 2003 to make way for extension to Broadcasting House. This extension would eventually be renamed the Egton Wing, and then the Peel Wing. Until recently, the studios were located in the basement of Yarding House, which is on Great Portland Street in central London. They used to broadcast from two main studios in the basement, Y2 and Y3. These two main studios are separated by the live lounge, although it is mainly used as an office. There are rarely live sets recorded from it, as Maida Vale Studios is used instead for larger setups. The studios are linked by webcams and windows through the live lounge, allowing DJs to see each other when changing between shows. Y2 is the studio from where the Chris Moyles show was broadcast and is also the studio rigged with static cameras for when the station broadcasts on the live cam. The station moved there in 1996 from Egton House. In December 2012, Radio 1 moved from Yarding House to new studios on the 8th floor of the new BBC Broadcasting House, Portland Place, just a few meters away from the Peel Wing, formerly the Egton Wing, which occupies the land on which Egton House previously stood. It was renamed the Peel Wing in 2012 in honor of the long-serving BBC Radio 1 presenter, John Peel, who broadcast on the station from its launch in 1967 up until his death in 2004. Programs have also regularly been broadcast from other regions, notably the Mark and Lard Show, broadcast every weekday from New Broadcasting House, Oxford Road, Manchester for over a decade, the longest regular broadcast on the network from outside the capital. UK analog frequencies Radio 1 initially broadcast on 1214 kHz medium wave and moved to 1053 1089 kHz on November 23, 1978, but did not broadcast nationally on FM until 1988. The BBC was allocated 3 FM frequency ranges in 1955, for the then Light programme, Third programme and home service stations. This meant when Radio 1 was launched, there was no FM frequency range allocated for the station, the official reason being that there was no space even though no commercial stations had yet launched on FM. Because of this, from launch until the end of the 1980s, Radio 1 was allowed to take over Radio 2's FM transmitters for a few hours per week, Saturday afternoons, Sunday tea time and evening, most notably for the top 40 singles chart on Sunday afternoons, 10 p.m. to midnight on weeknights, including Sounds of the 70s until 1975, and thereafter The John Peel Show and most bank holiday afternoons when Radio 2 was broadcasting a bank holiday edition of Sport on 2. In 1988 the 97 99 MHz frequencies became available when the existing police communication allocation changed, and Radio 1 acquired them for its own national FM network. This was rolled out as of September 1, 1988, starting with the Central Scotland, Midlands and the North of England areas. FM broadcasts were available in London as of October 31, 1987, but this was at low power on 104.8 MHz FM. Radio 1 made great efforts to promote its new FM service, renaming itself on air initially to Radio 1 Fathom and also later on as 1 Fathom until 1995. The Conservative government then decided that to increase competition on AM it would disallow the simulcast of services available on both AM and FM. Therefore, Radio 1's old medium wave frequencies were reallocated to Talk Radio UK in 1994. Radio 1's last broadcast on MW was on July 1 that year, with Stephen Duffy's Kiss Me being the last record played on MW just before 9 a.m. In the initial months after this closure, a pre-recorded message with Mark Goodyear was played to warn listeners that Radio 1 was now an FM-only station. During this time Radio 1 began broadcasting on spare audio subcarriers on Sky Television's analog satellite service, initially in mono and later in stereo. Digital distribution The BBC launched its national radio stations on DAB digital radio in 1995, however the technology was expensive at the time and so was not marketed, instead used as a test for future technologies. DAB was officially launched in 2002 as sets became cheaper. Today it can also be heard on UK digital TV services Freeview, Virgin Media, Sky and the Internet as well as FM. In July 2005, Sirius Satellite Radio began simulcasting Radio 1 across the United States as Channel 11 on its own service and Channel 6011 on Dish Network satellite TV. Sirius Canada began simulcasting Radio 1 when it was launched on December 1, 2005. The Sirius simulcasts were time-shifted 5 hours to allow US and Canadian listeners in the Eastern Time Zone to hear Radio 1 at the same time of day as UK listeners. On November 12, 2008, Radio 1 made its debut on XM satellite radio in both the US and Canada on Channel 29, moving to XM 15 and Sirius 15 on May 4, 2011. Until the full station was removed in August 2011, Radio 1 was able to be heard by approximately 20.6 million listeners in North America on satellite radio alone. BBC Radio 1 can be heard on cable in the Netherlands at 105.10 fathoms. Sirius XM cancellation in North America at 12 a.m. on August 9, 2011, Sirius XM ceased carrying BBC Radio 1 programming with no prior warning. On August 10, 2011 the BBC issued the following statement. The BBC A-1 registered trademark S commercial arm BBC Worldwide has been in partnership with Sirius Satellite Radio to broadcast Radio 1 on their main network, since 2005. This agreement has now unfortunately come to an end and BBC Worldwide are in current discussions with the satellite radio station to find ways to continue to bring popular music channel, BBC Radio 1, to the US audience. We will keep you posted. Thousands of angry Sirius XM customers began a campaign on Facebook and other social media to reinstate BBC Radio 1 on Sirius XM radio. 1 week later, Sirius and the BBC agreed on a new carriage agreement that saw Radio 1 broadcast on a time-shifted format on the Sirius XM internet radio platform only, on channel 815. The channel is still unavailable on the satellite platform of the service. Starting on January 15, 2012, the official chart show began broadcasting on Sirius XM 20 on 20 Channel 3, at 4 p.m. and 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. On August 19, 2014, Sirius XM again stopped carrying BBC Radio 1 programming with no advance notice. The stream is no longer available on the Internet radio platform. Regionalization From 1999 until 2012, Radio 1 split the home nations for localised programming in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, to allow the broadcast of a showcase programme for regional talent. Most recently, these shows were under the BBC Introducing brand. Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland had their own shows, which were broadcast on a 3-week rotational basis in England. From January 2011 until June 2012 Scotland's show was presented by Ali McRae. Formerly it was hosted by Vic Galloway, who had presented the show solo since 2004, after his original co-host Gil Mills departed. Wales's show was hosted by Jen Long between January 2011 until May 2012. Previously Bethan Elfin occupied the slot, who had at one time hosted alongside Hugh Stevens. Until Stevens left to join the national network, Phil Taggart presented the Northern Irish programme between November 2011 and May 2012. The show was formerly presented by Rory McConnell. Before joining the national network, Colin Murray was a presenter on the session in Northern Ireland, along with Donna Legg. After Murray's promotion to the network, Legg hosted alone for a time, and on her departure McConnell took her place. The regional opt-outs originally went out from 8 p.m. to 10 p.m. on Thursdays and were known as The Session in the Nations. They later moved to run from 7:30 p.m. to 9 p.m., with the first half hour of Zane Lowe's programme going out across the whole of the UK. On October 18, 2007 the regional programmes moved to a Wednesday night Thursday morning slot from 12 a.m. to 2 a.m. under the BBC Introducing banner, allowing Lowe's Thursday show to be aired across the network. Prior to this change Hugh Stevens had presented the Wednesday midnight show nationally. In January 2011, BBC Introducing was moved to the new time slot of 0000 to 0200 on Monday mornings, and the Scottish and Welsh shows were given new presenters in the form of Ali McRae and Jen Long. The opt-outs were only available to listeners on the FM frequencies. Because of the way the DAB and digital TV services of Radio 1 are broadcast, the digital version of the station was not regionalised. The BBC Trust announced in May 2012 that the regional music programmes on Radio 1 would be replaced with a single programme offering a UK-wide platform for new music as part of a series of cost-cutting measures across the BBC. In June 2012, the regional shows ended and were replaced by a single BBC Introducing show presented by Jen Long and Ali McRae. Content = music = because of its youth-orientated nature, Radio 1 plays a mix of current songs, including independent alternative, rap, hip-hop, rock, house, electronica, dance, drum and bass, dubstep and pop. Due to restrictions on the amount of commercial music that could be played on radio in the UK until 1988, the station has recorded many live performances. Studio sessions also supplemented the live music content, many of them finding their way to commercially available LPs and CDs. The sessions recorded for John Peel's late-night programme are particularly renowned. The station also broadcasts documentaries and interviews. Although this type of programming arose from necessity, it has given the station diversity. The needle time restrictions meant the station tended to have a higher level of speech by DJs. While the station is often criticised for waffling by presenters, an experimental More Music Day in 1988 was declared a failure after only a third of callers favoured it. News and current affairs Radio 1 has a public service broadcasting obligation to provide news, which it fulfills through newsbeat bulletins throughout the day. Shared with OneXtra, short news summaries are provided roughly hourly on the half-hour during daytime hours, with two 15-minute bulletins at 12:45 and 17:45 on weekdays. The main presenter is Chris Smith, with Tina Daly presenting during Radio 1's breakfast hours. Online visualization and social media In recent years, Radio 1 has aimed to include more of its content online in order to relate to the changing nature of its audience. Its YouTube channel now has over 1 million subscribers, and many features and events are streamed on both that and the Radio 1 website. The station also has a heavy presence on social media, with audience interaction now occurring mainly through Facebook and Twitter as well as text messaging. It was announced in 2013 that Radio 1 had submitted plans to launch its own dedicated video channel on the BBC iPlayer, where videos of live performances as well as some features and shows would be streamed in a central location. Plans were approved by the BBC Trust in November 2014, and the channel will launch on November 10, 2014. Controllers. Presenters. BBC Radio 1 operates a system that separates all of the DJs between day and night DJs. Day DJs play music generally orientated around the Radio 1 playlist, night DJs play more eclectic and specialised new music. Daytime nighttime Notable programming Breakfast The Breakfast Show has been presented by many famous names over the years. Currently this slot is broadcast between 6:30 a.m. and 10 a.m., Monday to Friday, and is hosted by Nick Grimshaw. Chart show BBC Radio 1's chart show had aired the UK singles chart exclusively on Sunday afternoon since the programme began. But this was moved to Fridays in July 2015. Currently broadcasting from 4 p.m. until 7 p.m., the format, length and starting time have varied over the years, but it has always finished at 7 p.m. For many years, the show prided itself on playing all 40 singles in the top 40, but this practice ended when Wheeze Butters took over as presenter in 2003. Then only tracks below number 20 to be played were the new entries. Special programming Bank holiday programming. Radio 1 provides alternative programming on some bank holidays. Programs have included the 10-hour takeover, a request-based special, in which the DJs on air would encourage listeners to select any available track to play. 40th birthday, On Sunday 30 September 2007, Radio 1 celebrated its 40th birthday. To mark this anniversary, Radio 1 hosted a week of special features, including special shows hosted by music legends at 9 p.m. each weekday. Between 9 a.m. and 10 a.m. on The Chris Moyles Show, the best music from the last 40 years. Playing Radio 1's old jingles, which were created by Jam Creative Productions. 40 different artists performed 40 different covers, one from each year since Radio 1 was established. All 40 songs were played in the weeks leading up to the release of the compilation album Radio 1 established 1967. On the anniversary day, Chris Moyles was joined on a special breakfast show by Tony Blackburn. Vernon Kay interviewed past breakfast show presenters including Noel Edmonds, Dave Lee Travis and Mike Smith. Ex-breakfast show hosts Sarah Cox and Zoe Ball teamed up to present an anniversary show on the Sunday. Past newsreaders including Peter Bowes, Richard Evans and Rod Mackenzie returned to present bulletins. Charity. Radio 1 regularly supports charities Comic Relief, Sport Relief and Children in Need. On March 18, 2011, BBC's Radio 1 longest-serving breakfast DJ Chris Moyles and sidekick Dave Vitti broadcast for 52 hours as part of a Guinness World Record attempt, in aid of comic relief. The pair stayed on air for 52 hours in total, setting a new world record for radio DJ endurance marathon, a Euro1 registered trademark after already breaking Simon Mayo's 12-year record for Radio 1's longest show of 37 hours, which he set in 1999, also for comic relief. The presenters started on March 16, 2011 and came off air at 10:30 a.m. on March 18, 2011. During this, Fionn Cotton made a bet with DJ Chris Moyles that if they raise over £2 million she will appear on the show in a swimsuit. After passing the £2 million mark, Cotton appeared on the studio webcam in a stripy monochrome swimsuit. The appearance of Cotton between 10:10 a.m. and 10:30 a.m. caused the Radio 1 website to crash due to a high volume of traffic. In total, the event raised £2,622,421 for comic relief. Events Radio 1 Roadshows The Radio 1 Roadshow, which usually involved Radio 1 DJs and pop stars travelling around popular UK seaside destinations, began in 1973, hosted by Alan Freeman in Newquay, Cornwall, with the final one held at Heaton Park, Manchester in 1999. Although the roadshow attracted large crowds and the style changed with the style of the station itself, such as the introduction of whistle-stop audio postcards of each location in 1994, they were still rooted in the older style of the station, and therefore fit for retirement. BBC Radio 1's Big Weekend. In March 2000, Radio 1 decided to change the roadshow format, renaming it One Big Sunday in the process. Several of these Sundays were held in large city centre parks. In 2003, the event changed again and was rebranded One Big Weekend, with each event occurring biannually and covering 2 days. Under this name, it visited Derry in Northern Ireland, as part of the Music Lives campaign, and Perry Park in Birmingham. The most recent change occurred in 2005 when the event was yet again renamed and the decision taken to hold only one per year, this time as Radio 1's Big Weekend. Venues under this title have included Herrington Country Park, Camperdown Country Park, Muir Park which was the first weekend to feature a third Stagia Moat Park, Lydiard Park, Bangor and Carlisle Airport. Tickets for each Big Weekend are given away free of charge, making it the largest free-ticketed music festival in Europe. BBC Radio 1's Big Weekend was replaced by a larger festival in 2012, named Radio 1's Hackney Weekend, with a crowd capacity of 100,000. The Hackney Weekend took place over the weekend of June 24, 2012 in Hackney Marshes, Hackney, London. The event was to celebrate the 2012 Cultural Olympiad in London and had artists such as Rihanna, Jay-Z and Florence and the Machine. In 2013, Radio 1's Big Weekend returned to Derry as part of the City of Culture 2013 celebrations. So far, Derry is the only city to have hosted the Big Weekend twice. In May 2014, Radio 1's big weekend was held in Glasgow, Scotland. Acts which played at the event included Rita Ora, the 1975, Katy Perry, Jake Bugg and Pharrell Williams. The event was opened on the Friday with a dance set in George Square, featuring Radio 1 dance DJs such as Danny Howard and Pete Tong, and other well-known acts such as Martin Garrix and Tiesto. Ibiza Weekend Radio 1 has annually held a dance music weekend broadcast live from Ibiza since the 1990s. The weekend has performances from world-famous DJs and Radio 1's own dance music talents such as Pete Tong and Annie Mac. BBC Radio 1's Teen Awards Since 2008 Radio 1 has held an annual event for teenagers aged 14 to 17 years. Originally named BBC Switch Live, the first event was held on October 12, 2008 at the Hammersmith Apollo. The event has been hosted by various Radio 1 DJs and guest co-hosts. In 2010 the event was renamed BBC Radio 1's Teen Awards, and includes awards given to celebrities and particularly inspirational young people. Now hosted at Wembley Arena, the event has included guests such as One Direction, Tiny Temper, Fall Out Boy and Jessie J. The 2014 event took place in October and was hosted by Nick Grimshaw and Rita Ora. Edinburgh Festival Radio 1 often has a presence at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe. Past events have included the Fun and Filth Cabaret and Scott Mills, the musical. See also: List of BBC radio stations, Radio 1 podcasts, MusicCube. References. Sources. Further reading, Edwards, M. Radio 1, established 1967 inches. London, The Sunday Times. Retrieved October 3, 2007. External links. Official website.